Hello everyone, I am back and in this session I will be talking about poetry recitation. Yes, so I'll be telling you some pointers about how to make poetry recitation fun, interesting, engaging. So the first point of poetry recitation is speech clarity. Yes, speech clarity. No matter how fast or slow are you reading or speaking the text, but if your speech is clear, your listeners will be able to engage and always be with you on the same page. Hence, speech clarity. For speech clarity, let us again go back to all the vowel speaking and the consonant sounds. The sounds that we did in the previous class and the vowels that we've been doing, that we've been practicing all throughout. That was speech clarity. The second point is effortless. Yes, effortless. When I say or when I talk about effortlessness, you should be so thorough and firm with the word and with the pronunciation of the poetry or of any text, because if you are struggling as a speaker or as a storyteller, as a narrator, your audience's focus will shift on you than on the text. Hence, effortless. So if there is a difficult word in your poetry or in your text, you can either choose or go for an easy word, or you can become thorough or be the master of that word in when it comes to pronouncing the word, so that the audience doesn't shift its focus on you or on the word, but sticks or stays with the meaning and the flow of the whole poetry. So that was point 2, effortlessness. Point 3, and this is specifically for a poetry, is to follow the meter. Of course, we all know that a poetry always has a meter. Now, this is very tricky here because we think that a poetry is a poetry because it rhymes. Yes, of course, that's like the most common factor of a poetry. But there are some poetries which do not always rhyme, or which has a very odd rhyming pattern, which has a very broken rhyming pattern, and it's really not fixed. But there is still a meter in a poetry. So it's actually very helpful if you can figure out the meter of the poem and stick with that meter and follow the meter, because that meter is what gives the poetry its unique structure. And I think if we follow the meter, we justify the author's intent or the poet's intent. Hence, it's important to follow the meter. Point 4 is pauses. Yes, pauses. Pauses are very important, not just in poetry, but also in any monologue, in any storytelling, or in any dramatic form, actually, in any performing form. So, pauses. When do we pause? And when do we not pause? Pauses, they add stress. So if you are talking something very serious, or if you are going to reveal a secret, or if you want the audience's attention, you want them to really focus on what you're speaking something, and you take a pause. So pauses, they actually are a build-up to the focus point. Whenever you want to emphasize something, just before that, you take a pause. So the audience pays more attention to you. So that's pause. That's number 4. And now, number 5. Number 5 is repetition. A poetry always, or at least in some cases, has a repetition. The first line or the first two lines of the poetry will always repeat itself. So that repetition is very important. Why? Because that repetition, or what the poet wants to repeat, is something of prime importance to the poet. That is something that the poet stresses on, which is why the poet has repeated those lines or those words in the poetry. Now, the repetition, it doesn't have to be a plain mechanical repetition. Suppose there is a phrase or there's a line. Let's say there's a line, the poor old lady. Oh, the poor old lady. This one phrase, the poor old lady, is repeated twice. But how do you say? Because the poet stresses on the poor old lady. Oh, the poor old lady. The poor old lady. Oh, the poor old lady. The poor old lady. Oh, the poor old lady. Why does the poet stress on this phrase, the poor old lady? Because she's the central character of this text or of this poetry. And the repetition has to have some meaning. You say first the poor old lady to introduce this old lady as a character, and the second time when you say the poor old lady, you draw an extra attention to this poor old lady with a certain emotion. Oh, this poor old lady. Meaning the story that is to follow has some sad narration, or the story that's to follow has some expression of pity. So every repetition also has to have some intention. So a repetition with intention. And now, point number 6, voice modulation. Even in poetry or in monologues or short storytelling, we have several characters. If it's just poetry and maybe there's just one character, but that character is talking about something, yeah? So there are different emotions, maybe there are different characters, even in the poetry. Maybe you are giving voice to some different character and you become the narrator again. So, voice modulation, it always adds more fun to the text, be it poetry or monologue or any script. So, always go for different voices. You can go for a natural voice as the narrator, but when a different voice comes or when a certain sound comes, if the poetry has a lot of sounds, you can always introduce different sounds. Just with whatever is available. You can create sounds with your mouth, you can create sounds with your gestures, with your hands, with your body, and that would also add a fun element to it. So that is another point, voice modulation. And now the last point. This is gestures. Small gestures, not big gestures, but if you can also add some little gestures to your storytelling, your poetry recitation, or your monologue, that would be great. Because gestures, it definitely shows some characteristic of the character that is there in the poetry. So a gesture with a voice modulation would be interesting. So that's the last point, small gestures. So I hope you got all the points cleared, and now you can read any poetry keeping in mind these points. So here's a poetry. It's a fun poetry actually. It's titled COVID Haircut. Since because of COVID we aren't allowed to go out, so how do we get a haircut done? So here's a sister who wants to get a haircut done, and just because it's COVID and she can't go out, she gets her haircut done by her own sister. And it's a fun story. So let's just hear what happens to this whole process of haircut. So here's the poetry. I had to get a haircut. It was looking much too long. I let my sister cut it. I mean, what could she do wrong? She clipped the bald spots here and there. She whacked the sides a little, and then she shaved a 3-inch stripe directly down the middle. She chopped some sections super short, left others long and wild, then shaved one eyebrow off before she looked at me and smiled. I don't think I'll let her give me haircuts anymore. Or maybe I'll just wait a while, at least until she's 4. So this poetry was written by Kenn Nesbitt, and that's it. You can actually read this poem, which will appear after this video. And you can also give your original inputs. You can also give your original thought to this poetry. You can use all the above pointers that we just discussed. So all the best.